Good evening. Good evening. Let's give a huge round of applause for Chelsea Remick for the national anthem. Beautiful. And also, let's give it up for our wonderful entertainment tonight. Mike Goodwin on guitar, Matt Hutchinson on piano. I don't know where they are, in the back there. And a final thanks to Amy Janess for all the work that she does to put these terrific events on at the Athenaeum. It's an incredible resource to the community, so thank you so much, Amy. So I'm Dylan Fernandez. I'm your local state representative. It's an honor to represent you at the State House. I also represent the Vineyard and part of Falmouth. And, you know, it's just such a pleasure to represent what I believe is the most beautiful district in our state. And there's a national conference of legislators going on right now, and I actually brought it down a delegation from Hawaii to the district. And about halfway through the day, they turned to me and like, you know what, this is even prettier than Hawaii. Yeah. Right. So, incredibly blessed to be here. And we just have a terrific program for you this evening. We're very lucky to have with us Treasurer Deborah Goldberg and Senator Ed Markey, both terrific advocates for our local communities. And before I get to the Treasurer, I want to say a couple words about our Senator, Senator Ed Markey. The Senator was actually my former boss. Right after graduating college, went to work on his campaign for about 5 weeks as my first job out of college. I think they were just picking up anyone off the street at that point. It's very unqualified to work for him. But it was a terrific campaign, and the Senator is such an advocate for our state, and is not only dedicated to policies that help advance Massachusetts forward and our nation forward, but also is just a terrific person to work for. And a true leader. And when we talk about Senator Ed Markey, the one thing, the main thing that comes to my mind is that he's a leader on climate change, a leader on protecting our environment. And he's made tackling climate change and promoting environmental stewardship as a top issue way before anyone else was talking about this. And we in Massachusetts know that a handful of climate deniers down in DC do not speak for the people of Nantucket, do not speak for the people of Massachusetts. And Senator Ed Markey embodies that, representing us in Massachusetts down in DC. So thank you for your advocacy on the climate. Also, the Senator's been an unwavering advocate in addressing our opioid and heroin epidemic, something that we know is a really hard-hitting issue here on Nantucket, and just recently called on the administration to issue a national public health emergency around our opioid and heroin epidemic, something I really think is a great initiative to move forward in addressing this epidemic. So thank you so much, Senator Ed Markey, for all your work. And I know the Treasurer will share a little more about all the Senator's been up to. So, speaking of the Treasurer, we are incredibly lucky to have Treasurer Goldberg here with us this evening, someone who has been to Nantucket many, many times, cares deeply about our local community, has met with many leaders across the community to discuss what's going on in Nantucket and how the Treasurer's office can help. And the Treasurer has been an advocate for working families, vulnerable people, children, and women. She's made equal pay for equal work a top issue for our state and was an absolute leader in advancing the pay equity bill. That's incredibly important to make sure that we have equity between men and women in our state, because we know that women in Massachusetts still make 82 cents on the dollar. Latino women actually make 50 cents on the dollar, black women around 60 cents on the dollar. So there's huge inequities, even in Massachusetts. And we need to make sure that we are addressing those equities. We're leveling the playing field between men and women in our state. And so thank you, Treasurer, for all your work on that issue. And the last thing I'll say is, the Treasurer has been working on a lot of issues across the Commonwealth, and another key initiative coming out of the office is initiative for free tax preparation for really vulnerable, underserved communities. Because we've seen how these nefarious actors go after vulnerable populations and take money away from their tax refund. So the Treasurer has been advocating for decades for financial security and financial preparedness, especially for our vulnerable communities. So without further ado, I just want to introduce our Treasurer Deborah Goldberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. So I'm not the main event, so I'm going to be really quick, and this is not about me today. But when I heard that one of my favorite guys, Eddie Markey, who I've known for 40 years, so Dylan, you might have been right out of college, so I was going into college, and now you know how old I am. And of course, a treasurer knows math. But when I heard that Ed Markey was going to be here today, I said, I am more than happy to come and introduce him. Because when Dylan talks about the fact that Senator Markey has been ahead of the curve on climate change, it goes back almost 40 years. He got it early. And if we don't do something about it now, and he talks about this and he'll talk about it today, our world will never be the same. And we see it all over this island. We see it at the Cape, but we even see it in the city areas. When black bears are climbing trees in Brookline, you know we have habitat infringement and that we are confusing our entire ecosystem. And Ed Markey has been the leader on the environment, on climate change, on energy, on telecommunications and the impacts of that since I can remember. But he was also very early on the opioid problem we have here. And that opioid issue, it's not solely in the cities. It's not solely among populations at risk. We all see it. We've seen it in our friends' families, we've seen it in our relatives, and we see it in this terrible death rate throughout this state. And what I love about Ed, he's still a Malden guy. He's still who he is. He is here. He is forever present. I'll go out to Pittsfield, and who's there with me? Ed Markey. I'll go to North Reading. Who's with me there? Ed Markey. Lowell, Lawrence, New Bedford, Dover. We go everywhere, but he is there. He's there for the people of this state. He's here for the people of this country, and he's there for me as your treasurer. If I pick up the phone and I call and I say I have a problem, Ed is going to be there for me in all the work that I do for all of you. So it is a true honor and not at all a problem to get off the beach in this gorgeous weather. But I am here to say, I love you, Ed Markey, and I know everyone in this room is looking forward to hearing about all the fighting that you are doing for us in Washington and throughout our country. Senator Edward Markey.
Deb Goldberg, ladies and gentlemen. Deb Goldberg. The best state treasurer in the United States of America. Our books are balanced. And Deb has spent her whole life as an activist, as a leader, a community leader. And when she announced that she was going to be a candidate for state treasurer, it was almost like we find this truth to be self-evident, that Deb Goldberg should be our treasurer. And she just does a fantastic job for our state. And the old TV commercial about E.F. Hutton really counts for her. When she speaks, people listen about the finances of our state, and she does it on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And she is emblematic of who we are in Massachusetts, what we stand for, and all of the values that we try our best to inculcate into every single policy that we try to stand for and be the leader for the rest of the country. We're only 2% of America's population, Massachusetts, but we are, we think, a very special 2% of the whole population. And Deb Goldberg is the pluperfect example of what we are. So thank you so much, Deb, for being here. And you know, all you need to know about that young man who just stood up here, this Tyro state representative representing the Cape and the islands, is that his name in and of itself talks about how great our country is and how great our state is. Dylan Fernandez. This is where we've come to and where we're going to continue to go, and what it is that makes us such a special state and a special country, and how hard we have to fight in order to make sure that Dylan Fernandez and all the people who are like him can stand up in this next generation, representing this incredibly dynamic change which has taken place in our country. And all I can tell you is this guy is the rising star. This is somebody who, when he now speaks on the floor of the Massachusetts state legislature, that people stop to pay attention, because he speaks for a whole generation of young people in this state. And I am so proud that his first job was working for me. So thank you, Dylan, so much for being here. And we have former state representative Tim Madden is here. Tim, where are you? If you can raise your hand. Thank you for coming, Tim. We feel very safe being here tonight, and I think having Sheriff Jim Perlman here is a big reason for that. So we thank you, Jim, for coming. I partner in Washington on a daily basis with one of the greatest congressmen in America, Bill Keating, and I'm just so proud to be here in one of the great places that he represents in his congressional district. The same is true for State Senator Julian Cyr, who with Dylan kind of creates this new partnership of a new generation of great leaders for our state, and it's just so great to have him representing us as well. And how about Chelsea singing that Star Spangled Banner? Wasn't she great, Chelsea? And Mike and Matt, who performed before Chelsea sang, I think the three of them kind of combined to say that President Trump perhaps is making a mistake in arguing that we should zero out the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. We should be continuing to invest more in all of these incredibly talented young people in our country. So thank you for being here. My wife Susan is sitting right here in the front row. She is from California, and she grew up in Palo Alto. She did her medical training at Stanford Medical School, and you know, she was thinking, well, she's from California, huh? And she's marrying someone from Malden in Massachusetts, and it's a Jewish doctor, so it's kind of, I married the dream as an Irish politician from Malden, but I think she's seeing the benefits of my having a constitutional responsibility to come to Nantucket, okay? Because this is one good part of the job. So thank you all for being here tonight. there's a little bit of PTSD going around, post-Trump stress syndrome, okay? And it can hit you at any time of any day on any channel that you turn to, any tweet that you decide to read, any Facebook posting that you might happen to look at. And at the core of it is this kind of idea that he kind of represents something that is going to make America great again. But after 6 months, I think we see that his goal really is to make America hate again, to divide the country, to have us be separated by race, by country of origin, by religion. And all of that is, at its heart, just fundamentally wrong. Because most of us who are here are beneficiaries of preceding generations of people who ensured that, unlike their fathers and mothers or grandmothers and grandfathers, that they were able to maximize their God-given abilities by putting these healthcare and education programs, these policies of non-discrimination on the books. And he's looking at these policies and saying, well, I don't think we need them anymore. But I think the people in this room know that if you want to live like a Republican, you have to vote like a Democrat in order to create the opportunities so that people can aspire to reach higher goals for themselves and for their families. So we're in a very, very controversial time in our country's history. We have a president who just finished the least productive first 6 months of any president in the history of the United States. His my way or the highway attitude has made it impossible for him to work with the Congress, but it's not what the American people want. But if he wants to fight, then we had to do so. So when John McCain came out at 1:30 in the morning and voted no to preserve the Affordable Care Act, as Deb was referring, inside of the Republican policy that they were seeking to advance would have been a reduction from $90 billion for opioid treatment over the next 10 years, which is in the Affordable Care Act today, if it had never been amended, and to cut that in half for $45 billion, in half. So as the epidemic explodes and as the amount of treatment which is necessary continues to be identified, he was going to head in the opposite direction, even as he contemplates doing everything he can on the opioid crisis. So you are what you are when you act and not with what you say. So he said that he was amazed about what he learned up in New Hampshire and all of the drug problems up there in that state. But then you have a concomitant responsibility to ensure that you're going to put the programs in place that can deal with the issue. In brief, in Massachusetts, 2,000 people died in 2016 from opioid overdoses, 2,000 people. 76% of them had fentanyl in their blood system. So it started with Oxy and Percocet, moved on to heroin, and now 76% have fentanyl in their system. We are dying in Massachusetts at 3 times the national rate. If you multiply the 2,000 who died here, and we're 2% of America's population, that would be 50 times 2,000 would be 100,000 people would have died last year in the country. Only 33,000 died in the country, but that's, in a lot of ways, just something that Massachusetts might be a preview of coming attractions, unless we really do put programs in place. Now, over 10 years, that would be 1 million people. That would be 20 Vietnam Wars worth of deaths that would occur from the opioid crisis if we don't put the programs in place. And so this battle, this public health battle, which, by the way, hits Nantucket as badly as any other community in Massachusetts or the country, obviously demonstrates that we need more programs. We need more help for these families. We owe an apology to 2 million African-American young men who we incarcerated during the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1990s. We owe that entire generation an apology. We didn't offer them treatment, we incarcerated them. And now they're out on the streets and people say, oh, very difficult now to hire these people, to work with these people. Well, hopefully we've learned this lesson and that we will fully fund the treatment which is going to be necessary. My wife worked at SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Agency, when I met her 32 years ago. And at that time, both mental health and substance abuse were stigmatized. And to a certain extent, they still are. We've made some progress, but it's a disease. You have to provide treatment. You have to help these people. And so this battle that we just had over the healthcare bill goes to a very large extent right to that issue. Are we going to provide the help to these families? The issue of climate change that Deb raised and Dylan raised. Well, to use a public health, my wife retired as a 2-star admiral in the Public Health Service and Assistant Surgeon General and the first head of women's health in our nation's history during the Clinton administration. Using her kind of analogies is the planet is running a fever. There are no emergency rooms for planets, and so we have to engage in preventative care in order to avoid the worst, most catastrophic consequences for the planet. So the president is getting his climate change information from Trump University, I think, and it's as bogus as a degree from Trump University, just as bogus. But it's, of course, funded by the Koch brothers. The consequences, however, of avoiding this reality could be catastrophic for the planet. So 2016 was the warmest year ever recorded in the planet. How do we know? We measure with this very complicated technology, thermometers, which we've been using for 150 years just to measure the temperatures. It's not complicated science. Just keep looking back to the records. Thomas Jefferson, for 50 years, kept the temperatures at Monticello every single day. He's the father of the American Weather Service. Okay? They have a weather station on Monticello. Right? So we can go back as far as his records for 50 years in Virginia, just moving forward. So the 2016, the warmest, passing 2015, which passed 2014, which passed 2013, 16 of the 17 warmest years ever recorded on the planet have occurred since the year 2000. So this is real, it's happening, it's intensifying. The water is warming off of the coast of Nantucket, out in the Gulf of Maine, right off the coast of Massachusetts, where we are, is the fastest warming body of water on the planet. That's where you are right now. When we had that huge snowstorm 2 years ago, when we had 112 inches of snow up here in Massachusetts, but there were only 22 inches of snow that same winter up in Anchorage, that was these cold waves coming down from Alaska, hitting water temperatures that were being measured 21 degrees warmer than normal off of our coastline. And when that combination hit, it created this incredible precipitation event, day after day, week after week, that just kept bringing that snow down on us. That is climate change. That is what happens when you ignore the consequences. The cod and the lobster of Massachusetts need cold water. They're moving north. They need cold water. And we're seeing fundamental changes even in the economy of the fishing industry here in Massachusetts that can be directly tied to climate change. And who does he name? He names Scott Pruitt as the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Attorney General of Oklahoma, who sued the EPA 19 times as the Attorney General of Oklahoma. What did he sue on? Clean air, clean water, smog, soot, mercury. In the confirmation hearing, I said to him, Mr. Pruitt, will you recuse yourself on all of the matters that you actually sued the EPA on? He said no. I said to him in the hearing, that makes you the plaintiff, the defendant, the judge, and the jury on the key issues of the public health of the United States of America. He named Rick Perry as the Secretary of Energy, the agency he could not remember when he was asked which agencies he was in. But he is now going to be the head of that agency and try to make sure that no one ever remembers it again as another climate denier in one of those agencies. At the Department of Agriculture, they just named as the chief scientist someone who was the leading proponent of Obama as having been born in Kenya. Just got named the new chief scientist for the Department of Agriculture. By the way, under which the Department of Forestry for the United States comes. It's under that umbrella, the Department of Agriculture. The budget for fighting fires at the Department of Forestry has gone from 16% of their total budget 20 years ago to 55% of their total budget last year, heading towards 68% of their budget in 5 more years. It will no longer be a forestry department, it will be a fire department that will have to deal with the consequences of climate change. Right? And so that's just the reality of what is happening, and they name another person who just should not have that job at the Department of Agriculture. What's the good news? I'll give it to you. Well, let me just finish on one final fact, because I spent the afternoon meeting with officials from Nantucket over at the high school, so they all came in one after another to kind of lay out the issues that affect this great island. Their top person said to me that if Hurricane Sandy had hit Nantucket, that 1/4 of all of the homes would have been totally destroyed on Nantucket. If we got the same hit that New Jersey got, 1/4 would have been gone. And you all know where those homes are. So that's how serious this is. That's the preview of coming attractions unless we put the preventative care in place. Here's the good news. In 2005, only 70 megawatts of solar energy was installed in the whole country. In 2016, 14,000 new megawatts. So just think of the Seabrook nuclear power plant as 1,000 megawatts, 14,000 new megawatts of solar energy installed in our country in 2016. 8,000 new megawatts of wind installed in our country in 2016. Last year, you hear Donald Trump talk about the 50,000 coal miners and how he really cares about them. And we do care about them. We want to make sure that their families are taken care of. We want to make sure that they have an opportunity to make transitions to new industries. But at the same time, the coal industry has dropped from 51% down to 31% of all electricity in our country. And in 2016, 50,000 new jobs were created in the solar industry alone. As many jobs as exist in the entire coal industry were created in 1 year in the solar industry. By 2020, there will be 500,000 people working in the wind and solar industry in our country if it just continues at its existing projection, 500,000. 50,000 coal miners, 500,000 people. He says he cares about blue-collar workers. Who are the solar and wind blue-collar workers? They're electricians up on your roof. They're roofers up on your roof. They're steel workers who are making the turbines for the wind that will be coming off of the coast of Massachusetts, but so far out you won't be able to see it from Nantucket. And they are blue-collar workers. As a matter of fact, the clean energy revolution is the single largest job creation engine for blue-collar workers in 2 generations in our country. It can turn into millions of new jobs in our country if we just put the right policies in place and we have a vision for where we should be going rather than looking at ourselves in a rearview mirror back at the 18th and 19th and 20th century. We just have to keep moving on. That's what young people want to do. That's where the opportunities are. And that's where China is heading. That's where India is heading. That's where Germany is heading. And so it's just a business opportunity for us. And we have to ensure that we fight for what we know is right. Not only the science, the environment, the economic opportunities, but also the moral responsibility to pass on this planet better than we found it. And we have a chance to do it, but we have to fight for this clean energy revolution that can save all of creation by engaging in massive job creation, that can employ millions of people in our country. So that's worth fighting for. Donald Trump is wrong, plain and simple, on that issue, and it goes right to the core of what we should stand for. We're in Massachusetts. We're not an honorary place. We're the Bay State, but we're also the brain state. We know that we can create jobs there. We know that when the president says he wants to cut the NIH budget by 20%, that he's cutting into the future. He's cutting into finding the cure for Alzheimer's or diabetes or the whole range of issues or diseases that run through everyone's family. And the one hope that we have is that NIH stands for National Institutes of Hope, and the research is medicine's field of dreams from which we can harvest the finding to give hope to families that we can find those cures. And here in Massachusetts, in Boston, in Kendall Square, we've become the #1 location for medical, biological research on the planet. On the planet. It's who we are. We draw tens of thousands of the smartest people in the planet who come to Boston. And when the president says he's going to cut the budget by 20%, for us, we get $2.5 billion a year from the NIH for research. And that's an electromagnet pulling in the smartest people from around the country and around the world who want to come as a result to Boston. The National Academy of Sciences, we get $500 million a year. That draws in thousands of other very smart people who want to be here. CDC, $100 million a year. We get it. We draw in even more smart people there. It's our business model. We try to draw the smartest young people to come to school or to work here. We try to create the capital that then they can be used in order to start up their small companies and hire smart people. We ensure that we give them the smartest, most well-trained workforce in the world. We're #1 in the world. We're #1 in the United States at the 4th, 8th, and 10th grades in math, verbal, and science. #1, math, verbal, and science at the 4th, 8th, and 10th grades. If we were a separate country of 6.7 million people, we would be Singapore. That's who we would be competing with. And we provide 98% of people with health care, and we have 4.3% unemployment. We don't think it's a choice. You can have a good, clean environment, a clean energy future, provide health care, education, and still be a job creation engine. We are capitalists here in Massachusetts. I don't think it's as fully well understood across the rest of the country. We believe in it, but we believe in capitalism with a conscience. We understand that we have a responsibility to help those who also need opportunities in our society. So we thank all of you for being here. And I'll just conclude, and then we can take questions if you would like, and I will be glad to try to answer anything that you might want to raise. But on the question of North Korea, I am the senior Democrat on the East Asia Committee. Cory Gardner from Colorado is the chairman. I am the ranking member, the lead Democrat on that committee. What President Trump is doing is reckless, it's dangerous. #1, there is no military solution to this problem. Any kind of actual military action that either country engages in could very quickly cross a tripwire that leads to an escalation that ultimately could, in fact, become a nuclear confrontation between our two countries. #2, we have to engage in urgent diplomacy. There is no, believe it or not, ambassador to South Korea right now. There is no assistant secretary for Asian affairs right now. That's very consistent with the president saying that he wants to cut the State Department budget by 30%. Even the Secretary of Defense said that he thought that we needed more talking and fewer bombs if he had his choice. But that's just part and parcel of this message which Donald Trump has been sending. And so it was dangerous yesterday when Secretary Mattis said that North Korea should be careful or else it could lead to regime change and a total destruction of their country. Talking about removing from the face of the earth an entire country is a very provocative statement that may or may not be correctly interpreted by the leader of a country that also has nuclear weapons, North Korea. By the way, they have enough nuclear weapons to right now destroy South Korea and Japan. They have the capacity to do that right now. And by the way, we have 29,000 young men and women along the demilitarized zone right now with all of their families as well. So any potential escalation has a consequence that is unimaginable. And so Donald Trump, compare him to Jack Kennedy, who during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his advisors and generals, they were pushing him to be more aggressive, to pursue the military option. But Kennedy was stepping back and being more cool and collected and detached, actually, and trying to analyze all of the options to avoid having to have this military confrontation, and actually ensuring that through his brother and others, there would be this back channel ongoing conversation with Khrushchev to make sure that there would be no misinterpretation of any of the statements that were being made in public. That is not happening right now. In fact, our hope right now is that the generals will control the president, not that the president will control the generals. And we're concerned that some of these generals are even saying things that make us wonder what is in fact a control mechanism that is working inside of this administration. I've introduced even tougher legislation with Cory Gardner that would just put a vice-like grip on the North Korean economy the same way that we did with the Iranian economy that drove them to the table on their nuclear program, and John Kerry was able to negotiate an agreement using that vise-like grip on their economy. We need to do the same thing in North Korea and impress China to, in fact, ensure that there are not escape routes that their economy can use in order to not suffer the full consequences. That's the route that we should go, and then in that context have a diplomatic resolution of this issue. But my concern really is that they're trying to play kind of a good cop and a bad cop as you listen to different voices in the administration, but the ultimate kind of Tower of Babel result is kind of a Keystone Cop, lack of confidence that you have in what is taking place. So I think what I'll do is just stop right here. And if any of you have any questions that you want to ask, you can come up here. And Ahmad has... oh yeah, it's so congested here. So Ahmad will come down, Ahmad Rivera will come down this corridor, or Christina Pacheco or Vanessa Gatlin will come down this aisle and just hand you the microphone so that you can ask a question. So does anyone out here want to begin? Yes, sir, back here. We'll stop back here.
Senator, thanks for being here. I'm Jim Perlin, Nantucket County Sheriff. I've got a couple of things I'd like to ask you about. One would be mental health. Since some of the people I deal with, some of you in the room have probably seen me with people waddling onto the boat or the plane. Those people are incarcerated, but 80% of them have mental health issues. So I'm thinking that we need more money for rehabilitation than incarceration. I'd like you to comment on that. But the other thing I'd like to say, 2 years ago I had surgery in Boston, and I was in overnight at a famous hospital, and everything came out all right. But I left there with 40 OxyContin pills. Now, I don't have an addictive personality, but if I did, that might lead me to the next step with this opioid issue we have. I think it's an issue for the drug companies, but I'd ask you if you could address that, please.
Okay. On mental health, there's a direct correlation between mental health and the opioid epidemic. I had one mother say to me that she has now come, her son did overdose, but she said to me that she came to understand that her son needed something to soothe his mind at night, you know, and when he found the Oxy or the Percocet in the early stages of maybe a broken leg or something, and he came to really enjoy how he felt, and then still needing to something to soothe his mind, he moved on to heroin, and then ultimately on to fentanyl, and passed away. And so you're right, we need an intervention at some stage here where we're dealing with these mental health issues, we're properly funding it, we're treating it not in a stigmatized way, but as a disease. I'm married to a psychiatrist. This is a problem where 20% of all adults will suffer from a serious depression at some point in their adult life. And if it's untreated, especially with people who then have injuries as well that are physical and these drugs are given to them, Oxy and Percocet, unfortunately we find in too many instances that's the pathway in that ultimately leads to the overdose. So funding mental health programs in conjunction with this opioid epidemic is absolutely essential. And that was the fight that we were continuing to make because those mental health programs would have been slashed as well. 50% of all people, by the way, who receive medically assisted treatment for opioids receive it on Medicaid. And they were going to cut Medicaid by $800 billion and package it up as a tax break for the wealthiest people in the country. The upper 1 percentile need a tax break right now far less than millions of people need the medical care for these diseases in our society. So that was really the core of the debate which we were having, and you put your finger right on it. We wound up with an overprescription epidemic. So I will just take 2 more minutes. 1996, Purdue Pharma got FDA approval for a drug called OxyContin. The representation that they made to the FDA was that it was non-addictive, even though they knew it was addictive. The FDA swallowed it and approved it. In the old days, when people were going to medical school, there were 4 vital signs, and you know what they are. The doctor's going to check your pulse. The doctor's going to check your blood pressure. And there was a number that got attached to these 4 vital signs. And then, beginning in 1996, there was a 5th sign. That was for pain. But unlike the doctor deciding what your pain was, you were asked by the doctor, on a scale of 10, how much pain are you suffering? Well, people who wanted the 2nd bottle of 30, the 3rd bottle of 30, they said, well, it's a 10, doctor, and they were just handed over to them. No questions asked, and the doctors were not actually trained to prescribe these pills either. There is no mandatory requirement that physicians actually take courses on this pain medication prescriptions. And it's still the case today. So what actually happened is all of a sudden we saw this huge spike. And as we are here this evening, 80% of all pain medication in the world is prescribed for the 4% of the world's population that the United States represents. So we're 4% of the population, we consume 80% of all pain medication. Next number. Of all people who overdose on heroin, 80% of them started on prescription drugs. So that's the pathway in. And we have to now begin to reverse this huge mistake, this perpetration, really, of a crime against so many families across the country in 1996 to today. It's why I put a hold on Trump's FDA commissioner nominee, just so I could hammer him on what was he going to do in order to be tougher on these pharmaceutical companies who make so much money from, in fact, prescribing these drugs. And so from my perspective, you put your finger right on it, and the mental health that should be provided to prisoners should also be provided to families across the country as a matter of a right, so that they can protect their families against the consequences of their mind needing soothing, and too many times just results in tragedy. So, next question. Yes, sir. Yeah, come on up here. Right here, Vanessa. Right here.
Yes, thank you. What do you think the likelihood is that in September the Republicans will come back and want to work with you to improve the Affordable Health Care Act as opposed to repealing it and replacing it?
Okay, that's a good question. Lamar Alexander, who is Republican senator from Tennessee, announced 2 days after that bill was defeated that he now wanted to work with Patty Murray, who was the lead Democrat on the Health Committee, to find a way to make sure that these health care exchanges did not collapse, that the insurance companies did not pull out of market after market, state after state across the whole country, because they were not going to receive the funding for these patients, for these individuals who were receiving care under the Affordable Care Act. Now that's a very hopeful sign, because most senators just don't stand outside of the super stop and shop, shaking hands with total strangers in order to get to Washington to make $174,000 a year in order to do nothing. They go because they want to do something good. And ultimately, it's not possible to win 100% in anything in politics. It's ultimately a battle that ultimately leads to that compromise. And that's how you make your progress in our society. So that's what I'm hopeful is now going to happen, at least in healthcare. What success Lamar Alexander might have in his own party, with his own Freedom Caucus over in the House of Representatives, I care not to prognosticate. But I do think that something has happened fundamentally with many of these Republicans. They're beginning to break more with Trump so that we can return to the natural order. In the first 6 months after I arrived in the Senate, National Journal did a study of all 100 senators, and they analyzed how many bills that are now law could be attributed to any one of the senators. So Orrin Hatch was number one. He had like 800 laws, and Barbara Mikulski had like 750 laws. And in number 8 was Ed Markey with 508 laws that are on the books of the 100 senators. Now, by definition, I had to partner with a Republican 508 times in order to get the bill passed. And the same thing then had to happen in the other chamber for it to go to a president's desk to be able to sign it, right? And so that's ultimately how the system works. On many issues, you can't compromise. You can't compromise. On gay marriage, there's a whole list of issues where we're right, they're wrong, right? But 90% of the issues don't fall into that category. Healthcare is one, education is one, the environment is one, where you're just looking at it factually, and you're saying we can work together here to find something, fashion something that makes common sense. So that's my hope, sir, and I'm glad you raised the question, because this was the least productive first 6 months ever, and the American people want us and expect us to work together, and I'm doing so with Cory Gardner on North Korea. I actually am the lead Democrat on the Space and Science Committee, and the chairman is Ted Cruz. But on our issues, I think we're going to be able to work together to try to partner on those issues. I'm going to disagree with him on many issues, but where it's possible, you have to work together. You just can't allow kind of some obstinate, obdurate objection to ever working with Republicans to get in the way of the public good of the whole country. So that is what I hope is going to happen, that there'll be a declaration of independence, because I could actually see an epiphany in many of these Republicans at the end of that first week of August, where many of them were beginning once again to say, There are 3 branches of government, and the executive does not tell the other 2, in fact, what to do, and that we are a separate and independent group. Now, we still have, let's be honest, we still have Donald Trump in a remedial constitutional law course, okay, so that he comes to understand that as well. But I think many of the members of the House and Senate are now coming to realize that and declaring their independence. At least that's my hope. Question, yes, back here, yes, ma'am?
First of all, thank you, Senator Markey, for representing the dignity and rights of so many of us and for being our voice. I thank you greatly. We at the Unitarian Leading House have many initiatives, and one of them is a small group called Make It Stop, where we're working to make sense of gun violence, to make no sense, of course, of gun violence in America, and working to understand some of the legislation around that. And I know there are so many issues happening in our country at this time, and wondering what you are doing about gun violence in our country, and if there's anything happening in the Senate at this time.
Well, it's not good when the President of the United States goes to the NRA convention and says, I'm with you unconditionally on every single one of your issues. Because, as you're pointing out, we have gun show loopholes where people can just go into a gun show and buy a gun and never have to go through a background check. You can go on Instagram and buy an Insta-gun and have no background checks. You can have situations which are now unfolding with legislation moving through the House where if your state allows for concealed carry, that you're capable of going to the other 49 states and just pulling out this protection which has been given to you by your state as they arrive in Massachusetts. And so you can keep going down each and every one of those issues. I introduced a bill 4 years ago which would call for $10 million a year to be spent by the Centers for Disease Control on studying this gun violence epidemic as a disease, so that we could begin to just think about and analyze what does cause our country to have the highest rate by far of gun violence in our country. It's over 30,000 people a year who die from it. Even that I cannot get these Republicans to support research at the CDC on that issue. So what is my goal? Yes, my goal is to turn NRA into not relevant anymore in American politics. But it's going to be a battle, you know, every single day in order to accomplish that goal. But it's going to come from the grassroots. And we're just going to have to continue to battle because common sense ultimately will break out. Thank you. Over here, Ahmad.
Thank you, Senator. Welcome to Nantucket.
Thank you. Beautiful.
You mentioned Massachusetts' performance on those National Assessment of Educational Progress tests, and yes, we are #1 and have been for several years. However, if you look at NAEP's exams for the Boston Public School District, you will find some of the largest achievement gaps across the country. Specifically, in 8th grade math, there is a 51 percentage point achievement gap between white students and black students, 45 percentage point achievement gap between white students and Hispanic students. The achievement gaps in 8th grade reading between whites and blacks and whites and Hispanics is over 40 percentage points. And yet, we've got public charter schools in Boston, the Brook Charter Schools, which comprise, their test scores for grades 3 through 8 for math and reading in 2015 were the highest, the absolute highest in the Commonwealth. We've got a charter school on Commonwealth Avenue, a high school, Match High School. In the last 3 years, 25 out of 26 Hispanic students passed AP Calculus. 30 out of 32 black students passed AP Calculus. These are the highest rates in the state. They are higher than Boston Latin Academy, and O'Brien. Now, my question is, You and the entire Democratic establishment, with the exception of Stephen Lynch, God bless him, opposed Charter or Question 2, which would have expanded Brooke and Match and would have helped more and more Black and Hispanic, helpless Black and Hispanic children move into a system of education where they could thrive as opposed to remaining in some of the worst public schools in the state. My question is how do you sleep at night?
Okay, good. Okay, thank you, sir. Let me say this, okay, and I should have added it, that we're number one in the 4th, 8th, and 10th grades in math, verbal, and science, but we're not happy with ourselves. We're not happy. We want to do better. We can see where the gaps are. We can see what needs to be done. We can see that we have to make sure that there's a democratization of access to opportunity for every child, and that we have to focus upon those who are most in need of additional help. So Susan and I, we live in Malden. I've lived in Malden my whole life. Here's Malden High School's graduating class last year. Malden High School's graduating class last year, 28% white, 25% Latino, 24% Black, 23% Asian, 1% Pacific Islander. 28, 25, 24, 23, 1. Right? That's where we live. Now, it's a good school, Malden High School. It's a good school. I mean, it's a minority school, but it's a good school. Now, Malden is, of the 351 cities and towns, we're down near the bottom quartile in income. I asked the headmaster last year, where are the kids going? And the headmaster said to me, well, number 7's going to MIT. I said, yeah, number 13's going to Tufts. Where's number 1 going? Well, number 1's going to UMass Amherst. Where's number 2 going? UMass Lowell, UMass Dartmouth, UMass Amherst, UMass Boston. Well, MIT, UMass Amherst, UMass Lowell, UMass Amherst. Yeah. Tufts, keep going. So what's going on? Well, those kids get into much better schools. They get into Tufts. They get into PC. They just can't afford it. Median income is $54,000 in Malden. That's not even tuition for one kid at one of those private schools. So they can't go. So kids from wealthier communities get to go to schools that they wouldn't even get into because their parents have money, but those kids do not, right? So that's just the reality of how college in America is today. So my father was a milkman for the Hood Milk Company. He had 3 sons, all born in the same year, me and then the twins the next year. We go to BC and BC Law School. My father's a milkman. I live in the same house. Kid on the same street that we live on today, got the same grades I got. Can't afford to go to BC, can't afford to go to Tufts, can't afford to go to any school that can't give them like the full boat. If you get into Harvard, they've got the money. Get into MIT, they've got the money to give you the full boat, but other schools, no. So the concern that I have is that I don't have any problem with increasing the amount of funding into the public school system in Massachusetts. That would be great if it's going to fund charter schools. But it shouldn't come out of the existing public school system, which is how it operates right now. So the debate has to be over how much additional money do you want to put into the system? Because there are a lot of kids, Hispanic and Black and Asian and other nationalities, in blue-collar communities all across Massachusetts who are doing quite well. And so if you're going to pull out all that money and then hand it over to charter schools, that's one thing, and you can set up the charter school system, but increase the funding, raise the taxes, and then say, we're going to do it. And so it's not that I don't care. I care a lot. Those are the kids that live on my street in Malden. I care more about them than I care about kids who I really don't have to worry about, whose futures are already taken care of on the day they're born. Okay? That's what I do every single day. I worry about them. I worry about their futures and how we're going to get them the education which they need. And the whole idea of just removing funding and then saying to the remaining kids and their parents, of course, the pressure will be greater for them to keep moving towards the charter schools, even though there's a lot to be said for that United Nations-like environment that has now been created in blue-collar communities all across America where these kids are going to school with everyone from every nation in the world. There's 76 languages in Malden being spoken in the school system. Right? There's a lot to be said for that. It's like Dylan Fernandez. Huh? We should be trying to make sure that we continue to fund that set of opportunities. So the son of a milkman can have a seat that John F. Kennedy had in the United States Senate. That's a good plan for the democratization of access to opportunity, but it costs money, and we're going to have to just have a debate over how much money we want to put into it. And charter schools should be there. So shouldn't Catholic schools, so shouldn't private schools, but each one should have the funding that they deserve given the magnitude of the problem which they are trying to deal with. And many of these families are going to they'll never understand how the charter school system works. They'll never understand how to apply for or even know that if they don't start early enough that they can, maybe put their kid over in this other school, and if they are going to stay in the public schools, then the funding should be there. So that's my view on it, and ultimately, that's why this whole attempt by Trump to cut the Department of Education budget by 20% is the crime against all those kids who, through all these funding formulas, try to target those kids who need the most help in our society. And many of them live in Malden, and all I can tell you is they're just as smart as all the kids from the preceding ethnic generations who lived in the very same homes. And if we give them the break, and we have free community college for them, and then if they do well in those 2 years, free access into the public universities of Massachusetts, the 21st century will be better than the 20th century was for our country, but we're going to have to pay the money in order to accomplish that goal. And that's the debate which we have to have in our society, and I'm ready to advocate for whatever amount of money it takes in order to fulfill your vision, but it should not come at the expense of the existing public school system. Yes, sir.
Senator, what's going to be the outlook this coming September for the budget crisis, debt ceiling, government shutdown? They're laying the groundwork for something. How are the Democrats going to deal with it? Or are the Democrats going to be made to look like they're the ones responsible for what's going to happen?
I think that they are very trepidatious about what is about to unfold in September because they control the presidency, the House, and the Senate. So they are the ones responsible for lifting the debt ceiling. They are the ones responsible for passing a budget. So they made a decision back 3 years ago that they would shut down the entire government over their inability to kill Obamacare. And the government was shut down for 12 days. And you know what happened? That was polling at like 80% negative. They learned a big lesson. They do not want to be responsible for shutting down the government again. Mark Twain used to say that a cat that's been burnt on a hot stove won't get on a hot stove again, but it won't get on a cold one either. And that's where they're going to be in September, trying to decide how much they are going to get burnt, and I'm very confident that we will be able to work out a resolution of the budget and the debt ceiling issues so that we can just continue on and into the new fiscal year. So I feel very good about that. Yes, sir, right in here.
Hello, and thank you for coming here. It's really an honor to meet you, Senator. And I'm interested in what you've been talking about climate change and the need to pursue alternative energy in the form of like solar and wind and stuff like that. But I'm curious, like, what's your opinion of nuclear energy? Do you think we should expand that, given how there isn't any sort of carbon emissions from that, and we have frameworks for it existing?
All right. Right now, in the United States, right now, just give you the number right now, 19% of all electricity is generated from nuclear power. 19%. If we continue along the current trajectory, just the current trajectory, no further breakthroughs in wind or solar, by the year 2030, 30% of all electricity in the United States will come from wind and solar, with no new breakthroughs, just the current pace. So that's 30 plus 19. Okay? So now you're up to 49%. 6% of all electricity in the United States comes from hydropower. So now that's 6 on top. Now you're up to 55% of all electricity is going to be generated by non-polluting sources, non-greenhouse gas emitting sources by 2030, just at current pace. There'll be a few more retirements of nuclear power plants, but that's pretty much where we're heading. Now, the problem for the nuclear industry is that there was just a bankruptcy that Westinghouse suffered down in South Carolina with a nuclear power plant that they thought was only going to cost $4 billion, and then it doubled to $8 billion. And so they've just abandoned it, and it led to the bankruptcy of Westinghouse. The same thing is happening with a nuclear power plant in Great Britain that the French were building. So what's happening over time is that nuclear has become less competitive in the marketplace with wind and solar and energy efficiency, and natural gas, by the way, which emits half of the greenhouse gases as coal. So utility executives, as they're making their decisions about which new electrical generating facilities they want to invest in, since it takes an extended period of time, years and years, to get a nuclear power plant licensed, sited, have the community be happy. And remember, the insurance for these plants is actually provided by the American people. It's called Price-Anderson, because they cannot get private sector insurance for something that could potentially have a large problem. So, and all of the above strategies should be in place. There should be equivalent tax breaks and incentives for each technology. And then let the winner play out. Since the price of wind and solar are collapsing, it's going to be more and more difficult for a utility executive to justify that investment. And as the price of natural gas continues to stay very low, it's unlikely they will move to a nuclear power plant, since you can build a new natural gas generating facility in a year or a year and a half, not 6 or 7 years that it takes for a nuclear power plant. And time is money when you're talking about an investment like that. You have great uncertainty over a long period of time. So when the Waxman-Markey bill passed in 2009, Henry Waxman and I put together a bill which passed on the floor of the House of Representatives, which would lead to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by the year 2050. And then Mitch McConnell killed it in the Senate. Otherwise, we would have, for the last 9 years, been operating under that bill, heading towards an 80% reduction. And in fact, President Obama used the number we had, a 17% reduction by the year 2020, in the promise he made in Copenhagen and in Paris, which we're going to meet by 2020, but that was our legislation. So that bill was actually endorsed by the Nuclear Energy Institute, by the Edison Electric Institute, because they said as long as they have flexibility in terms of what they're going to be able to invest in, then they're fine long term. They can make their investment. But ultimately, it's going to be a marketplace, Adam Smith-driven decision. And there may be some new nuclear power plants that are built, but I think the pace at which wind and solar are collapsing in price, energy efficiency is being incorporated into more and more businesses and homes in a much more effective way, and natural gas continues to dominate the marketplace. I just think that the place for nuclear will not be that large, okay? But it will continue to contribute its 18, 19, and 20% for some time into the future. Yes, sir, over here.
What kind of guy is Mitch McConnell actually like? On television, you can't get any sense of personality at all. I've seen senators like myself and Chuck Schumer trying to present an alternative viewpoint with a lot of logic and facts. He never even responds to what you guys are saying. He just kind of like a wall. So I was sort of curious what he's really like.
Here's what I want to say to you. He is a brilliant politician, okay? You have to give him that. Okay? We weren't supposed to lose the United States Senate in 2014, and we did. We were supposed to take back the United States Senate in 2016, and we didn't. His strategy, obstructionist when the Democrats had power, turned out to be a tremendous boon for them politically. But you have to understand I call it the Republican paradox. They don't believe in government, but they have to run for office in order to make sure the government doesn't work. And so when you control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, you're in the perfect form of it. And the first thing you can do is name a guy named Gorsuch to the Supreme Court in order to make sure that even at the Supreme Court, it reinforces this non-activist role that the government should play. So on certain things, I can go to him. So I went to him in May of 2015, and I said, Mitch, here's my idea. In 1964, there was a Surgeon General's report on smoking. It was seminal. 50% of all adults smoked in 1964. The Surgeon General's report was issued. We're down to 18% of all adults. Almost unimaginable how many families' lives have been totally changed by that person not dying, that person not catching that terrible disease. Incredible. So I said to Mitch, if you and I, Mitch, demand that the Surgeon General do a report on opioids, Lexington, Kentucky, and Lexington, Massachusetts, then I think he has to do it. And so he agreed with me. So Ed Markey, Mitch McConnell, we asked the Surgeon General to do that report. They said, well, it could take 2 years. I said, you should do it in 1 year. That's how urgent this problem is. And so the Surgeon General did it. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, they responded to us. And they issued that report last October. Just 15 months it took them to complete it, not 2 years, because of the urgency of the problem. So on something like that, and it just goes back to the question this gentleman was asking, on many, many issues, we are not going to agree. But where you can agree, you can go over, and you can try to find a way that you can make some progress on an issue of great importance, even as you're going to continue to battle. He and I, when I went over to him, he said, I don't want anyone to misinterpret this, Eddie, that we're ever going to agree on climate change. I said, absolutely, Mitch. Okay? No one will think that this is the doorway into an agreement on the science of climate change. And those were his words to me on the floor as I made the proposal to him. So that's how you have to kind of think of it. And then we'll battle on climate change. We'll battle over the role of coal as opposed to wind and solar in the future. He's a very interesting guy. If you're just a student of politics and how to be effective, and you know what? In many ways, we can learn a lot from him, so we can be more effective too in advancing our agenda and having that obstinacy in terms of how we fight as well and as effectively. So that's kind of how I would describe him, but a very smart guy. And a good politician advocating for his perspective. And from my perspective, we have to get better at what we do because the American people depend upon us becoming more effective as well. A question from anybody? Okay, back here, yes.
So at the beginning of your speech, you spoke incredibly persuasively about the merits of individual members of the up-and-coming generation. I think that if you look across the increasingly homogenous upper echelons of the Democratic Party, it's hard to see where that voice is being represented. I think that from Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi to Mrs. Clinton, Vice President Biden, and Bernie Sanders, it seems as if not only does the baby boomer generation have a monopoly on power, but the two coasts have a monopoly on power. So I guess my question is, do you think that in both 2018 and 2020, that under the current leadership, we're going to fare any better than we did in the Rust Belt states in 2016? And then also, if not, how do we get better at transitioning power to a more diverse group of leaders?
When I was elected to Congress, there was a small handful of blacks. People knew their names. They were so famous. People knew who Ron Dellums was. They knew who Charlie Rangel was. They knew who Shirley Chisholm was. There were so few of them, every one of them had a name that was known. The same thing was true for women when I was first elected to Congress. People knew their name. They knew Bella Abzug's name. They knew the name of Pat Schroeder, of Barbara Mikulski, as they were the first generation to arrive. They knew the names of the small handful of Latinos that were in the United States Congress. They knew who Kika de la Garza was or Henry Gonzalez was. Geraldine Ferraro. They knew who the women were, right? Today, there are 55 African Americans in the United States House of Representatives. There's 28 Latinos in the United States House of Representatives. We're knocking on the door of 100 women in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress. So there has been tremendous change. Many of them chair committees in the House of Representatives, representing their communities as they should have always been allowed to represent them. And so what we have is a set of issues, if you're going to talk about Midwestern districts, that need to be given a plan for ensuring that those blue-collar workers understand that we care about their families and their future, which is why I began by talking about the 500,000 jobs in wind and solar by the year 2020, rather than the 50,000 jobs in coal, and that we have to get better at making that argument. And as I gave you that number of 500,000 jobs in wind and solar by the year 2020, most of you did not know that, or even think that those are all blue-collar jobs and that those are jobs that Democrats advocate for, to make sure that those blue-collar families get their opportunities, and that it can expand to 1 million and 2 million as well. And that the educational opportunities which they need for community college, for job retraining, should all be funded. That's who we stand. That's what we stand for, and that's what Elizabeth Warren and I do every single day on the floor of the United States Senate. We lift our voices to fight for those issues, to deal with income inequality, to deal with the issues of health care and educational opportunity, to break down the discriminatory barriers that continue to block every person from being able to maximize their God-given abilities. That's what we do. And Bernie does a good job in raising his voice. Elizabeth does a good job in raising his voice. And so don't the Black caucus members and the Latino caucus members and the other voices, especially women, who are now heard and responded to. In fact, it was Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, Republican women, who put their thumbs down before John McCain did. So they have courage, they have vision, and by the way, they represent a knowledge of what has preceded up to this moment in history and are willing to fight for it every single day. The test should be how hard are you willing to fight every day to stand up for those people? And you don't win every fight and you don't lose every fight, but you have to have people who are willing to fight every single day for the advancement of our society. And as President Kennedy said, to truly do God's work here on earth. And that knows no age barrier. That's a test that voters have to decide for each and every candidate. Every time they run, they have to judge whether or not those people fulfill that responsibility. When I ran the first time for the Senate, you grow up where your mother tells your father he's going to have to live. That's kind of a rule. So my father was from Lawrence and went to the vocational program at Lawrence High School. My mother was the #1 girl in her class at Girls Catholic High School. But my grandmother died when my mother was 16. So she didn't get to go to college, even though 4 of the 5 sisters in the family were all the #1 girl in the class. They all had to go to work. That's how it was before Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so when she married my father, he had to move down to Malden. My father's a milkman for the Hood Milk Company. My father always said it was an honor that your mother married me, Eddie. She was the president of the senior class. And so when I announced for Congress, for the Senate rather, in 2013, I decided to go up and ring the doorbell in Lawrence at 88 Phillip Street to see who lives in Lawrence now on that first floor of the triple-decker where my father and his 4 brothers and sisters and my grandmother and grandfather lived on that first floor, across the street from the old South Mill. And when I rang the doorbell, because I wanted to see actually how 7 people could live on half of a first floor of a triple decker, huh? And have one of their sons become the senator from our state. So the door opened, and a Dominican family came out with their kids. And the accents were different, but the aspirations the same for that family as existed for the Markeys, huh? And that's the one thing you have to know about this fight. And it has no age barrier. You just have to decide if you're going to fight for that new America. You're going to fight for the future. Fight to ensure that those opportunities are going to be there for everyone. And so that's how I view these issues. I view them as just who has the ability to get up and to fight every single day. And that's what I try to do. I try to give it everything I've got every single day, you know, just to make sure that Massachusetts has the single best representation that they can have. And that's the great honor that this great state gives me. And so I'm... Yeah, yes, sir.
Senator, I know technology is one of your passions, and I would like to ask you if you could just touch briefly about internet security for American families and also internet security for our American institutions.
Everyone is entitled to a privacy bill of rights. In 2016, the Federal Communications Commission promulgated a bill of rights that required companies to obtain the opting in of every customer for the right to be able to reuse that information that you provide for the health care of your children or your shopping habits or whatever, in order for them to resell that information for their profit. They promulgated that rule, and one of the first things the Republicans did after they got into office was to use something called the Congressional Review Act, which allows them to look at a regulation that had been promulgated in the preceding 6 months in order to ensure that they would have an opportunity to overturn it. So Jeff Flake, who is a senator from Arizona, he brought out the Congressional Review Act repeal of those privacy protections. And it passed in the House, it passed in the Senate, and President Trump signed it back in March. That was a historic retreat from where we should be in terms of this relationship between all of these devices which we carry around, computers in our pockets, but which kids carry around in their pockets as well. If a mother is working with their 13-year-old daughter who may have anorexia, and the girl is going online looking for information about anorexia, should that now be a product that can be sold by whatever is that web company to all of the providers of services for that disease, or should that just be between the mother and the daughter? Huh? Should the daughter have a right to say, I do not want that information to ever be used or anything other than she's just looking for the information, right? I don't want her solicited. She's already vulnerable enough, huh? So there's a Dickensian quality, sir, and I know that's why you're raising the question. There's a Dickensian quality to the internet. It's the best of wires and the worst of wires simultaneously. It can enable and ennoble, it can degrade and debase simultaneously. And the technology is only as good as the human values which we build into it. You know, should an automobile have seatbelts? Should it have airbags? Should it have a padded dashboard? Well, the auto industry said for a long time, no, no, and no. But the public ultimately said, you must build in these safety protections for families. Huh? And the same thing is true for this, in terms of the privacy and security, which we have to require companies to build in as a matter of right for families, so that we're not compromised. And it has to be a matter of public policy in order to ensure that we guarantee those rights are there, because it might cost them a little more money. It might cost them some business opportunities. But at the end of the day, we have to ensure that our laws reflect that, and it's something that I've been fighting for throughout the entirety of my career, and I am going to continue to fight for that. I created the Privacy Caucus in the Congress in 1999, and a big chunk of all of the privacy laws that are on the books, because of my work, the reason that if you have a satellite dish here on Nantucket, and you might be browsing around TV channels on that satellite dish at 2 a.m. in the morning, the reason no one's ever going to know is my 1999 law. The company cannot sell that information to anyone, which channels you're clicking on and back and forth at 2 a.m. in the morning. Aren't you glad that's a law, that they can't sell that? So I view that as being true for all other information as well. It's your business. If you want to sell it to them, go ahead. Let them use it for whatever purposes. But if you don't, that should be your right as well. So, isn't that right, Colin? If you're still out there, yes. Let me give you the formula. Colin is my telecommunications staffer for 20 years. He now runs all government affairs for Twitter, nationally and internationally. And our little formula was, you have a right to know that information is being gathered about you. You have a right to know that the company intends on reselling that information for purposes that you had never intended it for, and you have a right to say no. Knowledge, notice, and no, right? And that's just a simple formula that every person in this internet era should be guaranteed to have. Yes, Christina. So I'm told that there's an event in this room right after this event. And I'm enjoying this. I could go on all night. But what I'd like to do, I'll take one more question, and then I apologize to you. But we're in the high season here in Nantucket, huh? And these rooms are, just absolutely perfect for so many other different functions. But tonight we're seeing a little bit of democracy in action. Yes, sir.
I was told to make this a good question. Now I'm a little nervous. But I first want to thank you, Senator, for your policy perspectives and your optimism about how our government and democracy really should work. It's nice to hear that, given everything else we're hearing these days. But my question then is, we do hear a lot today. And perhaps some may feel that our democracy and the guardrails of our democracy are getting tested more than ever in our lifetime. And lots of reasons for it. And so my question to you, Senator Markey, is there a concern that you have or your colleagues in the Senate, mostly on the other side of the aisle, that our guardrails of democracy are really being tested to a point where some profiles in courage have to be shown by others?
If your question is, do we have a crisis in democracy right now? The answer is yes. Post Citizen United, the amount of money, undisclosed, unknown, flowing into this political system is massive. And it's having a profound impact on the political system which we have. And it's impacting issue after issue across the board. The fact that we're debating whether or not it's appropriate for a president to ask the voting rolls for all 50 states to be sent to the White House so that they can examine it for voter fraud, when we know it's about voter suppression that would be the ultimate goal that they would use that information for. We know that when a president denies that the Russians were seeking to compromise our most sacred of all institutions, and why we began that American Revolution right here in Massachusetts, so that we could elect a president without any foreign interference in our election, from King George to today. That's what we've tried to do, and that revolution started right here. Yes, from Bannon to General Flynn, to Jared and Donald Jr., and that whole litany. Okay? It's absolutely imperative that on a bipartisan basis, we work to ensure that every bit of information is out in the public domain so the American people can know what happened during our presidential election last year and what kind of attempted compromise and perhaps even successful compromise of the electoral process occurred. And we need to have that investigation occur on a bipartisan basis with profiles and courage by members of both sides who stand up to ensure that we protect that very core function of democracy in our society. And by the way, that's who we've been here in Massachusetts throughout history, from the American Revolution to the abolitionist movement that started here, the suffragette movement, the Affordable Care Act movement, the gay marriage movement. That's who we've been. We've stood up to fight. And eventually that mood spread across the rest of the country. But you're right, it's a crisis. And we're going to need to respond to it in a bipartisan fashion. And at the core of it is this unbelievable amount of money that has moved into the political system. I'm mindful of the fact that I'm standing here in this great room that has hosted so many incredibly important people throughout our history. And I know that William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists spoke and fought, for issues that kind of changed our country when it had another crisis of democracy back in that era. And one thing that William Lloyd Garrison said at one point was, "With reasonable men I will reason, with humane men I will plead, but to tyrants I will show no quarter, nor waste my arguments." Okay? And so it will require people, if there are arbitrary actions that an executive branch seek to engage in, that require members of the House and Senate on a bipartisan basis to stand up and to fight. And so from my perspective, that's the great honor that Elizabeth and I have every single day, to be the 2% down there and standing up and fighting and ensuring that your views are heard, that Massachusetts is heard, and that voice, which has been so special since 1775, continues to be heard on the floor of the United States Senate. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you.